Mr. Spence, Judge Bunton, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in the brief time I have to address you in this historic trial, I want to point out what must already be obvious to you, that Lee Harvey Oswald and Lee Harvey Oswald alone is responsible for the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, our young and vigorous leader whose presidency stirred the hopes of millions of Americans for a better world and whose shocking death grieved and anguished an entire nation. But before I summarize that evidence for you against Mr. Oswald, evidence that conclusively proves his guilt beyond all reasonable doubt, I want to discuss several issues with you which the defense has raised during this trial. Several factors make it clear that Kennedy and Connally were struck by the same bullet. There's absolutely no evidence of the existence of any separate bullet hitting Connally. With respect to whether or not any shots were fired from the grassy knoll, I want to make the following observations. Firstly, it is perfectly understandable that the witnesses were confused as to the origin of fire. Not only does Dealey Plaza resound with echoes, but here you have a situation of completely unexpected shots over just a matter of a few moments. When you compound all of that with the fact that the witnesses were focusing their attention on the President of the United States driving by, a mesmerizing event for many of them, and the chaos, the hysteria, the bedlam that engulfed the assassination scene, it's remarkable that there was any coherence at all to what they thought they saw and heard. Human observation, notoriously unreliable under even the most optimum situation, has to give way to hard scientific evidence. And we do have indisputable scientific evidence in this case that the bullets which struck President Kennedy came from his rear, not his front. If either of the two bullets that struck President Kennedy came from the front, why weren't there any entrance wounds to the front of the President's body, nor any exit wounds to the rear of his body? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it couldn't be more obvious that there was no gunman at the grassy knoll. No one saw anybody with a rifle in that area. No weapon, nor expended cartridges from a weapon were found there. It didn't happen. With respect to Ruby killing Oswald, the evidence is overwhelming that he was a very emotional man. When we couple the fact that Ruby cared deeply for Kennedy with the fact that he probably thought that he would be viewed as a hero, Ruby's killing of Oswald has all the earmarks of a very personal killing, completely devoid of any outside influence. In the short time I have left, I want to summarize the evidence of guilt against Mr. Oswald. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, within minutes of the assassination, a 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano rifle, serial number C-2766, was found on the 6th floor of the book depository building. Oswald ordered the rifle under the name A. Hedel. We know that. We know from the testimony of Monty Lutz, the firearms expert, that the two large bullet fragments found inside the presidential limousine were parts of a bullet fired from Oswald's rifle to the exclusion of all other weapons. We also know from the firearms people that the 3 expended cartridge casings found on the floor right beneath that 6th floor window, undoubtedly the same casings that Mr. Norman heard fall from above, were fired in and ejected from Oswald's rifle to the exclusion of all other weapons. So we know, not just beyond a reasonable doubt, we know beyond all doubt that Oswald's rifle was the murder weapon that caused that terrible, terrible spray of brain matter to the front. The worst sight that I've ever seen in my entire life. And it's obvious that Oswald carried that rifle into the building that day in that large brown paper bag. It couldn't be more obvious. As far as Mr. Fraser's testimony about Oswald carrying the bag under his armpit, he conceded he never paid close attention to just how Oswald was carrying that bag. He didn't have any reason to. At this point, if we had nothing else, how much do you need? If we had nothing else, this would be enough to prove Oswald's guilt beyond all reasonable doubt. But there's so much more. Let's look at Oswald's conduct. November the 22nd, 1963, the day of the assassination, was a Friday. Whenever Oswald would go to visit his wife in Irving, go on a Friday evening, come back on a Monday morning. On the week of the assassination, however, for the very first time, he goes there on a Thursday evening, obviously to get his rifle for the following day. After the assassination, all the other employees of the book depository building return to work. There's a roll call. They're accounted for. Not Oswald. He takes off. The only employee who leaves the building. Just 45 minutes after the assassination, out of the 500,000 or so people in Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald is the one out of those 500,000 people who just happens to murder Officer J.D. Tippit. Oswald's responsibility for President Kennedy's assassination explains why he was driven to murder Officer Tippit. The murder bore the signature of a man in desperate flight from some awful deed. What other reason under the moon would he have had to kill Officer Tippit? Normally, ladies and gentlemen, in a murder case, a verdict of guilty brings about a certain measure of justice, obviously a limited amount of justice, but a certain measure of justice for the victim and his or her surviving loved ones. But here, the effect of this assassination went far beyond President Kennedy and his family. This was an enormous offense against the American people. And no justice could ever be achieved. I respectfully ask you to return a swift verdict of guilty against Lee Harvey Oswald, simply because it is the only verdict that is consistent with the evidence, evidence which conclusively proves Oswald's guilt beyond all reasonable doubt. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Bugliosi.